I still remember the morning it happened, the kind that feels ordinary, until one email changes everything. I was sipping black coffee in my cubicle, scrolling through reports, when the HR notification pinged. Salary credit delayed due to technical adjustments. Just one line. No apology, no explanation. At first I brushed it off. In corporate life, technical issues were as common as fake smiles. But when Friday passed and my account stayed empty, that line began to gnaw at me. By Monday, I went straight to finance. The HR manager avoided eye contact, mumbling something about temporary freezes. But the way she said it, the small tremor in her voice, told me this wasn't routine. My name is Alina, and I work as a financial analyst at Everwell Capital, one of the biggest M&A firms in the city. I'd spent 4 years climbing up quietly, building my reputation with numbers that never lied. But this time, it wasn't numbers that betrayed me. It was a person. His name was Daniel Cross, my direct supervisor, head of corporate finance. Charismatic, polished, and ruthless beneath that calm voice. Everyone called him the Deal Whisperer. I used to respect him, until I learned what power really meant to him. When I walked into his glass-walled office that morning, he barely looked up. "Alina, I'm aware of the issue," he said, flipping through a report like my existence was an interruption. "Then I assume you'll fix it?" I replied, steady but sharp. He smiled, slow and deliberate. "There's a reason your salary's on hold. Performance review irregularities. It's procedural. The word stung. I had just closed one of the firm's most complex deals, a $120 million merger that saved the company millions. There was nothing irregular about my work. Something was off. I could feel it in the silence that followed. He didn't want me to argue. He wanted me to accept. That night, I stayed late. The office was dark except for the faint hum of the printers and the reflection of city lights on glass. My computer screen glowed with spreadsheets, cold, obedient numbers. But behind the lines, I started to see patterns that didn't add up. Employee pay cycles, bonus disbursements, payroll authorizations. Someone had been rerouting funds, tiny fractions spread across multiple accounts. Not enough to notice at a glance, but enough to build something dangerous over time. And then, I saw it. His name, hidden under a secondary payroll ID, masked behind a special projects code that didn't exist in any of our public records. Daniel had direct payroll access, and he was using it. The next morning, he stopped by my desk. His tone was light, but his eyes, sharp. "Still waiting for your salary, huh? These systems can be tricky. Patience, Alina. It wasn't advice. It was a warning. That's when I knew this wasn't an accident. He'd frozen my salary on purpose. Maybe because I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. Maybe to remind me who held the real power. But what he didn't know was that I had already begun digging deeper. Every late night became an investigation. Every document a puzzle piece. He thought I'd panic, maybe even beg HR to intervene. But I didn't. I played along, calm and composed, while quietly tracing every shadow he left in the system. The deeper I went, the darker it got. Hidden allowances, altered ledger trails, executive signatures that didn't match. Daniel wasn't just manipulating payroll. He was using employee accounts to funnel money into offshore subsidiaries. He froze my salary to test me. But in doing so, he exposed himself. I began keeping a personal log, screenshots, transaction IDs, timestamps, careful not to trigger any alerts. I saved everything in encrypted folders, far from the company servers. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was survival. Because when a man like Daniel realizes someone's watching him, he doesn't apologize. He destroys. By the end of that week, I stopped sleeping. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be a termination notice. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was uncovering. In corporate finance, power doesn't scream. It whispers. It hides behind procedures, compliance checks, and temporary freezes. But I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. I just didn't know that by exposing him. I was about to uncover something much bigger, something that would shake the company's entire leadership to its core, and it all started with a frozen paycheck. The following week, I decided to play the quiet game. I smiled in meetings, nodded in corridors, and pretended to forget that my paycheck had vanished. Daniel wanted submission, so I gave him the illusion of it. But inside, I was building a silent war. My plan started small. I began volunteering for tasks that gave me access to the financial backend: budget reconciliations, audit prep, quarterly variance reports. The kind of work most people avoided because it was dull. For me, it was gold. Every document carried fragments of truth he thought he'd buried. Each night after everyone left, I'd stay behind. The office emptied out by 8 p.m., the cleaning crew humming down the hallway while I stared at spreadsheets like crime scenes. With every row and formula, I traced the fingerprints of a theft hiding behind corporate polish. One name appeared again and again: Daniel Cross. Sometimes disguised, sometimes direct. Payroll overrides tied to consultant bonuses that never reached the people listed. A few employees' accounts were used as shells, with funds rerouted before payday, then returned later, slightly altered. It was smart, sophisticated, and illegal. He'd built an invisible system where he could move money without triggering alarms. And the only reason mine froze? Because I stumbled into the pattern. I couldn't go to HR. They worked under him. And IT? He oversaw them too. Every official channel was a trap. So I reached out to the one person he underestimated, Sana, a junior accountant who handled internal audits. She was quiet, precise, and just as invisible as I pretended to be. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Just that I needed her help verifying an old ledger anomaly. When she ran a cross-check, her brow furrowed. "This ID, it's not in the employee registry," she whispered. I leaned closer. "Can you trace it?" She hesitated. "If I do, the system logs my access." "Then don't trace it," I said softly. "Just remember it exists." From that night, Sana became my silent ally. Days passed and Daniel grew bolder. He started dropping comments, subtle digs meant to remind me I was beneath him. "It's impressive how calm you are, Alina," he'd say with a smirk. "Most people panic when money's involved." I smiled back. "I've learned patience, sir. Numbers always balance themselves eventually." He didn't realize what that meant. By now, I had 3 weeks of proof: transaction logs, shell IDs, unauthorized payroll approvals. But it wasn't enough. I needed the how, the bridge between the official system and the ghost trail he'd built. That clue came by accident. Late one night, I noticed a recurring timestamp: 2:14 a.m., the exact moment his ghost transactions were executed. At that hour, the main payroll server was offline for maintenance, which meant someone had physical access to override it. And only 3 people in the company had that level of clearance. Daniel was one of them. I leaned back in my chair, pulse steady. He thought freezing my salary would keep me quiet, but it only gave me time to hunt him in silence. The trap was forming, line by line, under the glow of a single desk lamp. And soon I'd know exactly how deep his corruption ran. The deeper I went, the more dangerous it became. Every click, every file, every late-night access carried a risk I could almost feel breathing down my neck. Daniel had started to notice. It began with small things: an unexpected "how's your workload?" in the hallway, a sudden audit request for the same department I'd been reviewing, a subtle reminder that he was still watching, still in control. But fear had already turned into focus. One evening, while the office buzzed with post-deal chatter, I caught him standing near my desk, too close to my computer. "You work late too often," he said, his tone light, but his eyes cold. "Don't burn yourself out." He walked away before I could respond. My screen had been locked, but something about his timing wasn't coincidence. He was probing, checking if I'd found anything. From that moment, I stopped saving evidence on the company drive. Everything went into encrypted offline storage. I even created fake decoy spreadsheets with meaningless data, enough to mislead anyone snooping. At home, my dining table had turned into a small war room. Printouts covered in highlighter marks, sticky notes connecting accounts, offshore shells, and midnight timestamps. The pattern was no longer random. It was methodical. Money shifted through 3 layers of internal payroll accounts, disguised as contractor bonuses. then disappeared into a consultancy registered under Daniel's initials. He wasn't stealing from the company. He was bleeding it, slowly, precisely, in amounts too small to alert the board, and I was getting close to proving it. But the closer I got, the more he tightened his grip. HR suddenly sent me a performance concern memo, vague, baseless, conveniently timed. My access to certain files was restricted for system updates. Meetings I should have attended were suddenly reassigned. He was isolating me, cutting me off before I could finish connecting the dots. Then came the final straw. Friday morning, my access card failed. The security guard looked uneasy when I asked why. "Temporary suspension, ma'am," he said softly, checking the system. "It directive from Mr. Cross. He'd locked me out, literally." That's when I realized he was no longer just covering his tracks. He was preparing to bury me under them. But Daniel had underestimated something. In finance, data leaves ghosts, backups, logs, caches. And I'd already copied every digital trace onto a private drive hidden in plain sight. A USB drive disguised as a keychain I wore daily. He might have frozen my salary, but he couldn't freeze the truth. That weekend, I made a choice. If I stayed silent, he'd erase me, but if I acted too soon, I'd lose the chance to expose him properly. I needed to strike at the right moment, when his arrogance was at its peak, and that moment was coming, the quarterly. Board meeting was only 2 weeks away, the one where Daniel always presented his impeccable financial performance. He had no idea that this time, his own report would destroy him. The betrayal didn't come with a warning. It came dressed in professionalism, in a crisp email marked urgent. Monday morning, I opened my inbox to see my name copied on an internal memo. Subject: preliminary review. Unauthorized access investigation. My stomach dropped. It was from HR, but the signature line read, "Initiated by Daniel Cross." The message accused me of accessing payroll data beyond departmental clearance. They were calling it a breach of internal protocol. In other words, I was being framed for the very crime he was committing. For a few seconds, my fingers hovered frozen over the keyboard. Then I smiled, quietly. Because I'd seen this move coming, he was desperate now. At noon, I was called into the HR conference room. Glass walls, bright lights, and 3 faces that pretended to be impartial. Daniel sat at the far end, tie loosened, eyes sharp, but calm. "Alina," he began, "this isn't personal. We just need to understand why your credentials were used to access restricted payroll logs." I met his gaze. "Then you should probably ask whoever cloned them." He tilted his head slightly, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. "You're suggesting internal sabotage? That's a serious claim." "I'm aware," I said, leaning forward, "but not as serious as what you've been hiding behind consultant bonuses." The silence that followed was electric. HR glanced between us, clearly uneasy. He wasn't expecting me to bite back. Not here, not in front of witnesses. Daniel cleared his throat, pretending to stay calm. "We'll finish this review internally. You're suspended until further notice." "Then I'll see you at the board meeting," I said softly, standing up. That moment, the flicker in his eyes, told me he understood something terrifying. I wasn't bluffing. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the skyline. My access had been revoked, my accounts frozen again, and I was officially suspended. But I still had what he didn't: proof. I opened the hidden drive and reviewed every file, every transaction. I built a detailed report: timelines, ledger screenshots, off-record transfers, everything linked to his login trails. It was meticulous, impossible to deny. But I needed one final piece: the live connection between his payroll access and the offshore consultancy he used to launder the funds. Without that, the board could dismiss it as a system glitch. That meant going back inside. Sana called me later that night, whispering like someone afraid of being overheard. "Alina, he's cleaning up the system, deleting old logs. How much time do I have?" "Hours, maybe less." I didn't hesitate. I drove straight to the office. The building was half dark, security minimal. I used the emergency stair access card I'd borrowed weeks ago, from a janitor who didn't ask questions. By the time I reached the finance floor, it was silent except for the low hum of the servers. I slipped into Daniel's office, his nameplate gleaming faintly under the desk light. His computer was locked, but I wasn't after that. I plugged my drive into the payroll terminal next to his desk, the one connected to the internal network. Lines of data flooded my screen, logs, backups, and traces of deleted transactions. I ran the retrieval script I'd written days ago, the one Sana helped me perfect. Within minutes, the missing records appeared, and there it was, the offshore account, linked directly to his executive ID. I copied everything. Every last trace. Then, footsteps. Someone was coming. I yanked out the drive, killed the terminal light, and hid behind the glass wall. Daniel walked in, jacket off, eyes tired but alert. He must have felt it, that something was shifting beneath his feet. He poured himself a drink, sat down, and opened his laptop. For a second, his reflection caught the glow of the monitor. Spreadsheets, numbers, offshore transfers. Watching him work, oblivious to how close he was to ruin, was almost poetic. I slipped out quietly, heart pounding, clutching the drive like a loaded weapon. When I stepped into the cold night air, I realized something. This wasn't just about my salary anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about justice, the kind that doesn't wait for permission. Daniel thought he'd buried me, but in trying to erase my trail, he'd left his own wide open. And in just a few days, when he presented his glowing quarterly report to the board, I'd be waiting, with proof that would end his career forever. The weekend before the board meeting, I barely slept. My apartment floor was covered in documents, printouts, USB drives, backup copies, and handwritten notes. Every detail mattered. One mistake, and he'd spin the narrative before I could even open my mouth. I didn't want to just accuse him. I wanted to prove it, in front of everyone who trusted him. I knew the board meeting routine by heart. Daniel always opened with a performance overview, complete with glossy slides, inflated numbers, and fake smiles. He'd talk about profit stability and employee satisfaction, while his hands were buried deep in the payroll accounts he'd built like a personal vault. But this time, I was going to rewrite the script. The night before, I met Sana in a quiet cafe downtown. She was nervous, clutching her laptop like a lifeline. "Are you sure you want to do this, Alina? Once it's out there." "There's no going back," I finished for her. "I know." I slid her a small envelope. Inside was a clean flash drive labeled Project Nova, Daniel's favorite codename for his personal offshore setup. It contained every trace of his illegal payroll activity, neatly compiled in a presentation disguised as a financial forecast report. She exhaled slowly. "You want this cued in the board presentation deck?" I nodded. "Exactly where he expects his own slides to be." The plan was simple, but surgical. Daniel would walk into that meeting, confident as ever, with his laptop ready. But when he plugged into the board's central system, my mirrored file would override his. The visuals would look familiar at first, until the numbers began to turn against him. It was poetic justice, his own system betraying him. I spent that entire night finalizing the data. Every number, timestamp, and account ID aligned perfectly with the company's database. No one could claim fabrication. I even added a trail showing how the salary freeze on my account aligned with the same days he authorized transfers to his offshore entity. He'd tried to silence me by withholding what I'd earned. Now, I'd silence him with what he'd stolen. By Monday morning, I walked into the building like a ghost returned from exile. Whispers followed me, half curiosity, half fear. I ignored them all. The boardroom was already set up, and Daniel was there, charming as ever, greeting executives with his practiced ease. When he saw me walk in, his smile faltered. "Alina," he said under his breath, "you're not invited to this session." I smiled faintly. "I'm aware, but the audit committee requested my data verification logs for the presentation." He blinked, caught off guard. "They what?" That's when the board chair entered. "Ah, good. Both of you are here. We'll begin shortly." Daniel's composure cracked for a second. He looked at me, then at his laptop, like he was trying to guess what I'd done. The meeting began. Slides flashed across the large screen, graphs rising, profits soaring. Daniel spoke smoothly, confident again, until the numbers shifted, his graphs glitched, replaced by payroll logs, transaction codes, and a new heading: Unauthorized Payroll Access, Executive Level ID, D-Cross. The room went silent. Daniel froze mid-sentence, staring at the screen as the data kept rolling. Every transaction, every offshore link, every timestamp meticulously displayed. The board chair turned sharply toward him. "Daniel, what is this?" I didn't move. I didn't need to. My work was speaking for itself, he stammered, reaching for his laptop, but the files were locked, read only, preloaded. His own arrogance had given me the access I needed. The presentation ended with one final slide, the salary freeze entry. My name, the date, and the note: Manual Hold Authorization, D-Cross. He'd exposed himself, through the system he thought he controlled. And as the murmurs rose around the table, I finally allowed myself to breathe, but I wasn't done yet. Because corporate revenge doesn't end in the boardroom, it ends when the truth becomes impossible to bury. And I still had one last move to make. The room fell into a silence so sharp it could cut glass. Every executive froze, their pens halfway in the air, their gazes darting between Daniel and the glowing screen that now exposed him line by line. For a man who thrived on control, Daniel looked like he'd just seen his empire burn in slow motion. He tried to laugh it off. "This is clearly some kind of data manipulation," he said, forcing a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "These numbers are being taken out of context." But the board chair, Mr. Whitman, wasn't smiling. "Daniel," he said quietly, "this presentation came from your device." Daniel's jaw tightened. Then someone tampered with it. Probably her. He turned toward me, his voice rising, desperate now. "She's been under suspension for accessing internal data. You can't trust anything she—" I interrupted, calm and steady. "Every file on that screen was verified through your own payroll access key. You used it at 2:14 a.m. 3 nights each week. Do you want me to list the transaction IDs?" A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. The CFO leaned forward, scanning the data. "Wait, this isn't fabricated. These match the audit trail from our system backup." Daniel's composure shattered. His hand slammed against the table. "You don't understand. These were temporary reallocation tests. It's standard fraud?" The chair cut him off. He froze. The word hung in the air like smoke. I watched him. The same man who'd smirked at me when he froze my salary, now cornered by his own arrogance. I should have felt satisfaction. Maybe I did, but beneath it all, there was something heavier. The quiet realization that every sleepless night, every moment of fear, had led to this single point in time. Whitman turned toward me. "Alina, you were the first to notice these discrepancies?" "Yes," I said. "When my pay was frozen, I reviewed the internal ledger and found anomalies. Daniel's secondary ID had been accessing payroll sub-accounts linked to unregistered consultants. The money trail led directly to a private consultancy under his initials, D-Cross Management Holdings, registered offshore. The general counsel flipped through the printed evidence I'd distributed moments earlier, copies of every transaction I'd decrypted. The pages rustled like a storm building in the room. Daniel's face paled. "You think this proves anything? You can't present internal data without IT verification. It's inadmissible." "Then perhaps," Whitman said coldly, "we should have IT verify it right now." He pressed the intercom. Within minutes, the company's chief IT officer walked in. He plugged into the system, typed a few commands, and nodded. "Confirmed. These are real payroll logs. Executive ID matches Mr. Cross, and the offshore account exists." Daniel's last layer of defense crumbled. He looked at me then, really looked at me. His voice cracked just a little. "You don't understand, Alina, the board. They would have cut funding for the new merger. I had to move funds around temporarily to keep us afloat. It wasn't theft." I met his gaze. "You didn't freeze my salary to protect the company. You froze it to protect yourself." The chair stood. "Mr. Cross, you're relieved of duty effective immediately. Compliance and external audit will take over from here." Security was called quietly. 2 men entered, discreet but firm. As Daniel gathered his papers with trembling hands, he turned to me one last time. "You think they'll thank you for this?" he said, voice low and venomous. "They'll use you, then discard you like everyone else." I didn't respond. Because maybe, in a way, he was right, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the truth was finally unchained. As he walked out, I felt a weight lift, but also the echo of something unfinished. The boardroom buzzed with whispers and half-formed questions, but I just sat there, still, watching the numbers flicker on the screen one last time. The empire he built on silence had collapsed, not with fire, but with data, precision, and patience. The meeting adjourned shortly after, chaos spilling into the hallways. Reporters would soon get wind of it. Corporate leaks always found their way out. But I didn't stay for the aftermath. I walked out into the cold air, sunlight breaking through the clouds, and for the first time in months, I felt free. But the story wasn't over yet, because power never dies quietly, and in the world of finance, exposure comes with a price, and I was about to learn mine. When the board meeting finally ended, the silence that followed was deafening. My boss didn't look at me as the security team escorted him out, his face pale, his confidence gone. I sat there, my heartbeat steady, my expression unreadable. Months of quiet humiliation, withheld pay, and sleepless nights had condensed into this single moment of justice. By the next morning, an internal memo went out. He was terminated for financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. The company's legal department quietly began proceedings to recover the misappropriated funds. HR called me in, apologetic and shaken. They reinstated my salary, doubled my bonus, and offered a public apology for what they called procedural oversight. But the truth was deeper. They knew he had been untouchable for years, protected by his charm and fabricated results. My evidence had cracked that illusion. I didn't celebrate that day. I didn't gloat or post a single word online. I simply walked to the office window, the same one I used to stare through when I doubted myself, and watched the morning light spill across the skyline. It felt like the first breath after being underwater for too long. People began treating me differently. Not out of fear, but respect. I wasn't the quiet analyst anymore. I was the woman who stood against the system and won. And though I was promoted later that quarter, it wasn't the new title that satisfied me. It was the peace of knowing that no one could freeze my worth again. He had tried to silence me through control. I had answered through truth, and truth once revealed doesn't fade. It burns. Justice didn't come overnight. It came through patience, precision, and restraint. I learned that silence can be more powerful than anger when it's backed by evidence. What he thought was control turned into his undoing, because he underestimated quiet observation. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about exposure. When truth steps into light, lies collapse on their own. I never sought revenge to ruin him. I sought to reclaim myself. And in doing so, I discovered that power isn't given by a paycheck. It's earned in the moments when you refuse to be erased. This is Revenge Untold, where corruption meets consequence, and silence becomes strength. Don't forget to subscribe.